Okay, so we're going to talk about the individual service plan, but first I want to get kind of a idea of who's here in the room. So if you're a self-advocate, somebody who receives services, would you stand up? Stand up. Thank you. If you're a provider of services, would you stand up? Don't be shy, get the blood flowing, move around. If you're a service coordinator from the regional center, stand up. All right, and a family, parents, siblings, family. All right, well, thanks for being here, everybody. This was kind of a collaborative effort between the regional centers and providers to try to give kind of a holistic view of from the legislation to the implementation with the IPP and then down to the ISP, how do we provide services and make them as seamless as possible for folks so that they are meeting their goals. So the individual service plan is the agreement between the service provider and the consumer for what services they're going to provide. Inputs provided by all of the planning team participants, but it is the agreement between that person who's receiving services and that service provider. Best practices, again, the same thing Terman was talking about for the IPP. Best practices are person-centered. They identify the strengths and successes of the individual. They outline the supports needed, the methods to achieve the goals and objectives. They have measurable goals and objectives, and they meet the guidelines set forth in both the regulations as well as your program design and or any contracts you have with the regional center, and all of those are different. Timeframes and guidelines. Again, these are best practices, so don't be sitting out there going, wait, my program doesn't do that. We don't do an ISP then, or complete an initial ISP within 30 days of the start of services. You start serving somebody within about 30 days, you're going to want to have those services and supports identified in your ISP. You're going to come with a draft of an ISP for existing services to present at an IP and ISP meeting. It's really important to have joint meetings between the regional center, case manager, and the service provider at least once a year. We try to do them annually and semi-annually and have everybody on the planning team there at both of them. Ongoing review cycles are determined by regulation and planning team agreement. Typically, for day services and ILS, I believe it's annually and semi-annually. Other folks have different, but best practice overall.
For ILS, there's 13 categories as per the regulations, and once again, it's covered there under Title 17, so when you want to access this information on the website, you'll be able to look those up if you don't know. When you are writing your ISP, you should always make sure that you ensure that the goals include one of these 13 categories. If you have a goal for your consumer and it is outside these 13 categories, it will come up before the committee and it will be questioned. So as you're setting goals, keep in mind those 13 categories.
Again, like Herman said, I know I see people writing frantically. Yeah. These are all here. You have access to them at DDS's website. This PowerPoint is going to be on Alta's website, right? These are the training areas for day services: self-advocacy, community integration, employment training, and self-care. So if you have goals and objectives that you're writing with the folks that you're working with, you want them to fall under one of those category areas. I think it's really important to think about those areas when you're working with folks so that you're able to, and along with your service design, not everybody's day program includes all of those items. Some day programs don't do any employment training. That's just not what they do in their service design, so that's not what they're going to write a goal for in their service plan. Okay? Services and supports areas for supported living services. These are defined a little bit differently than training areas under Title 17 regulations. These are the 16 areas that supported living services provide services and support centers. And again, I see people writing. You can find all of these at the little links we provided, and this is all going to be up on Alta's website too. So writing measurable ISP. We're going to spend some time on this because I think it's something that's become much more critical as funds have gotten tight, as regional centers are looking at for themselves, how are we making our IPP goals and objectives more measurable? So are service providers. We're having to look at that, so we want to work on that a little bit. Measurable goals. They describe the targeted outcomes for which the service is being purchased as a support. They identify specific service objectives that relate back to the need identified. Joe wants to have a fun day. It's not going to be a measurable goal with objectives that we can list under there. In identifying the specific service objectives, you're going to want to look at what are the milestones, what are the steps to meeting those goals that people are going to be taking. Progress. Identify what measures will be used to identify progress made towards specific objectives. So you're going to want to be able to list out what is the progress that's being made in each objective to meet that goal. If you're not able to do that, I tell my staff when we're working on ISPs, project forward. You've written an ISP goal and you've written an objective, and now you're projecting yourself forward 6 months and you're writing progress on that. If I can't write progress that's measurable and shows where the person started and where they're going to and where they're at right now, then it's not measurable, and we need to go back and revamp it and reword it. Support needs. This is another area that has changed, I think, over the last year or two, is that we're having to be really clear about the supports that are needed for the person to be successful in the situations and environments and things that they want to be doing. As providers, I think we've been very, very good at saying all the positive things. This person's now working, and they're involved in the community rec center, and they're volunteering over here. But we haven't really been good at identifying what the support looks like in order for them to be able to do that. So on paper, if a case manager, maybe she just got this person, and they look at this paper and they say, oh, he's going to work and he's volunteering, and he's accessing the community rec center, fabulous, what the heck do they need you for? Well, we got to be better at telling people and identifying what are those supports that are needed for the person to be successful in the situations that they're involved in. That doesn't mean you have to get rid of your person-centered thinking. Doesn't mean you have to say, Joe would hit people 500 times if we weren't there with him, right? We can use person-centered language, and we can identify what support looks like. In order for Joe to do X, Y, and Z, he needs a support person that understands and can work through situations with him in order for him to have other alternatives to becoming physically assaulted. Whatever. We can use people first, person-centered and people first language to do those things.
For the assessments of hours for services, an assessment for a day program would differ quite vastly from an assessment from the ILS standpoint. And a day program assessment for an hourly rate day program versus a daily rate day program would also be very different. If you are given a purchase order to write an assessment, what you want to keep in mind are the ISP goals that you're going to be creating for this consumer. So while you're doing your assessment, you're looking at that individual going forward, because most programs within 30 days of starting the person will then be doing their ISP goals. So you have that person in your to do the assessment, and at that time you're going to be evaluating that person and looking at how you can spend your time with that person, what hours you would think you would need to be allocated to provide the services that you need to work with that individual.
other things that we need to really think about is our data collection and how we collect the information that backs up the progress. Something that I think I've heard from providers is the fear that we're going back to tracking sheets. And we're going to be following around somebody out in the community with a tracking sheet. Did they do this 3 out of 5 times? You know, and that's not a typical situation, and that's certainly not what we want to see in the community. So your tools and your measurement data can be anything. They can be tracking sheets that you do back at the office. They can be things like, gee, if somebody's going to work and one of their goals is to make it to work on time, you know, 90% of the time or 95% of the time, well, we can just simply check their attendance records with their employer, right? So we don't have to have artificial ways of measuring things. We can use naturally occurring things.